N.A.P. Connection is a panel discussion on selected art issues with 3 guests and the host, James Carroll. Home viewers are invited to call and offer comments or questions during the live telecast. N.A.P. Connection is brought to you by the New Arts Program, a nonprofit art service organization in cooperation with Berks Community Television. The New Arts Program is supported in part by the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, local government, area businesses, N.A.P. memberships, and individual contributions. Evening, I'd like to welcome you, and this is the N.A.P. Connection. And with me, I have as my guest Janet Roberts. And Janet, who is a teacher, lecturer, Fulbright recipient, what else?
Poet, editor, writer.
Editor, covering the whole parameter of anything that needs to be done and wants to be done.
Well, that I can do that someone will ask me to do, yes.
And what I'm going to do is turn it over to Janet, and she's going to sort of give you an index, table of content of what the next 55 minutes are going to be and how it's broken down. Okay, Janet?
Thank you, James. It's always good to be back here in Reading. It's a beautiful spring day. We are going to look at here and there this evening rather than there and here. We're going to start in Reading with Wallace Stevens' home. It's his birthplace. He went to NYU to law school, and he went to Harvard University. But he was born and lived here in Reading and went to high school here. And
so we both spent most of his life here.
Yes, and we both went and found his house, and we're going to share it with our viewers and hope that they'll visit it as well, and someday we might see it turned into a museum, which would be really wonderful. And I'm going to read a poem which every American listening should probably have heard at some point. Then we're going on to listen to an interview with Charles Bernstein, who is a poet and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and his wife, who is an artist and illustrator, and they live in New York City. And by way of introduction, we're going to see a little bit of the gates, which were in Central Park this winter, which many of our viewers may have seen, and certainly brightened the gray winter days for us who remained here and weren't off to the tropics. Following that, we are going to end with a homage to Mother's Day. And a homage to the first American president ever visiting Georgia, about which our viewers have heard 2-3 times from me in our discussions on this program, and I want to remind them that that was the place that they heard about, and that it is being visited by the first American president ever today, and actually given the time difference, at about 3 o'clock this afternoon. And so it brought back some memories, and we're going to return to Georgia, but we're going to honor Georgia not with politics, but with child protection, high-risk child protection, which is a project that I worked with there, and dedicate it to our Mother's Day here in America. And then we're also going to see in that segment a visit and a short interview with the delegation from Uzbekistan. And you remember I've shared a couple of programs about Uzbekistan and about the Nukus Museum and the Savitsky Collection and the wonderful tiles in Samarkand and Bukhara, and the activities with UNICEF and my Fulbright experience there. So the there will be Uzbekistan and the Beijing conference and a delegation from Uzbekistan, and the there will be a simultaneous broadcast here in Reading with President Bush being in Georgia today, meeting the new Rose Revolution president, Mikhail Saakashvili. So the first point of introduction before we go to the film and see Wallace Stevens' house is to look at one of his poems, and by way of tribute to honor Susan Sontag and this biography which came out about her about the time of her death, and that she has passed away in 2004 in December. And a street in Serbia was named after her because she spent quite a bit of time there after the conflict. And there was quite an announcement about her humanitarian efforts there. Coincidentally, I have been invited to go to Kosovo this summer to teach a seminar on Ismail Kadar. And he's written a beautiful little book called Elegy for Kosovo. And I wondered, as our viewers may wonder, who is Ismail Kadar? Well, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize 3 times. He is a man, as Edmund Keeley, who's the foremost translator of Greek poetry and who I just saw recently because he's bringing out a memoir on his childhood in Greece. He made a journey to Albania a few years ago for the State Department. And in there, he mentions Ismail Kadar. He says, there's a local famous novelist, Ismail Kadar, now living in Paris, who has pointed to human rights issues in Albania. I understand he returned recently to protest the imprisonment of a former president and 2 former prime ministers, all at one time rivals of the current president, Dr. Berisha. Am I right about that? And he's saying this to the president of PEN, PEN, which is the Amnesty group, and also the director of the Soros Foundation in Albania, the man holding both posts. And Piro Misha smiles and says, Kadar could have been president of this country. He is the most respected Albanian. So without knowing it, I've been introduced to the Havel, who was a playwright who became president of Czechoslovakia, but now has stepped down. Ismail Kadar. It's a beautiful, he's a beautiful writer. He's compared to Gogol and to Kafka and to Borges and to Marquez. And what he has in common, bringing the there here, which is always my task, is that the plains of Kosovo are filled with blackbirds. And you remember Wallace Stevens' poem about the blackbird, which is the one I want to read to link Kosovo, Susan Sontag's death and memory in Serbia, and my own anticipation of my mission there for 3 weeks this summer, is that poem which links the American landscape with the plains in Kosovo covered by blackbirds, which I'm looking forward to seeing. But what was the site of an extraordinary massacre in the 14th century by the Turks, and which gave justification, as Kadar points out in this elegy, for Milosevic to conduct another massacre. By what rationale, I'm sure we do not know, and I'm not here to discuss. But it's fascinating to know that concurrent with the Song of Roland, in England and France, at that time period, that in Kosovo, a much less known part of the world to us, in the Baltic states, there was a great poem written which honors King Michael in the plains of Kosovo and the blackbirds, about which I had known nothing, and about which I am learning something. And I'm looking forward to, as I have in the other countries, learning about the cultural heritage of these people. So I would like to remind our listeners of the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, which if they didn't read this in high school, they certainly missed an experience, and was one of my most memorable poems there and in college. 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. Oh, thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women around you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms. But I know, too, that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs.
I actually read that earlier this evening.
Yes.
And
well, it's meant to be read on the page. Wallace Stevens meant it to be read on the page as it is a poem, but to be performed as well. So that, by way of introduction, links those unknown mysterious blackbirds on this unknown mysterious plain in Kosovo in the 14th century to Wallace Stevens and the blackbirds on a page in his collection of poems. So why don't we go to the tape and see his house here.
Okay, do you want to lead into the tape?
Well, that's the lead right there.
Okay.
Let's go into the tape.
Should take a couple seconds.
This is our first book that we did together. And before that, I did several books on my own. But then we decided to try to set one of Charles's poems with the photos, the altered photos which I was doing. So this was 1981. And it's called The Occurrence of Tune. And it's one long poem.
All right, let's take a look at the book itself.
And the book has altered photographs. And they're facing pages, but not each page, and some of it's just text. And the idea is in all of the books, they're not literal illustrations, but they're actually, since the poem is fairly abstract, they're actually fairly abstract in response to the poem. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we didn't want it really to be a one-on-one illustration of the poem, but rather more of a poetic response to the poem. And that's sort of been the way I've been working on my collaborations since. Approach to the poem.
Okay.
So in the nude formalism, I made little settings, frames actually, for each poem, and then each poem is set in a different typeface. So this one's more about diversity rather than unity.
The poems are, change depending on how they look, quite apart from what you might think of as the pictorial dimension of the poem. The way in which the lettering is done, the font,
Right.
The way it is on the page, the size of the page also affects the meaning and the reading experience. We were trying in this book to go as radically against the concept that type shouldn't be self-conscious, that the type should disappear. And by having each poem done in a different typeface and having almost a kind of a neo-Victorian decorative quality in some cases and a kind of quasi-futurist style in the first one, and having these conflicting styles, it creates a dimension of what the poetic experience is, and then as well as the pictures. So in the end, this seems to me is what the poems are. They have to do with the visual design in the book. It led us both to Tucson, Arizona, when Emma was, a couple of years old?
When our daughter was like 3 years old, and we did this.
And to spend a week there to work on the book, so he had in mind that the three of us could go and do the book.
Fabulous.
And he would talk to us about what was possible with the printing and so on, like could we do gold and so on, which I guess you must have asked him.
Well, because the name of the
Perhaps
book
you
was
suggested.
Fool's Gold, so we decided to do it in black and gold.
Now
So it's
this,
printed in 2 colors.
this poem did not exist as an independent entity.
Did not.
No, he
this,
wrote
this
it.
is different. I actually.
Did
there
you
are
write it
some-
on site when you were there?
No, it's composed of a number of different elements, and
Fragments, actually.
some of them are actually poems that are discrete, that could be pulled out, like Trill, which is probably published in one of the, it is published in one of my other books. Trill might be the only thing. Then there are some individual lines. Some things are lines taken from things. So there's a number of different elements culled from different places, and some were probably composed specifically for the format and place that was created here. So this was not a discrete text. It doesn't exist apart from the book, although elements of this could appear in other things, although by and large they don't.
What came first then? Did
But he had
Susan?
a little notebook, you had little notebook entries.
I had a whole lot of, I had
And we cut
culled a
them
lot
up.
of individual sections, you might say.
So you selected
Either
them.
aphoristic comments or
Right.
or short pieces, and we had many of those things. And then
Fitted them to the
well,
space.
Susan probably picked which ones
I
she
think
wanted.
we picked
I'm
them
sure.
together, or I picked, like this says, you took the mouth right out of my words. There were these little phrases, and it was setting the little phrases, and then what's nice about it is that the type goes in all different directions, like, so it says...
Now, did you choose the text before you did the illustration, Susan?
I think sort of at the same time.
You just
Because I was
simultaneous-
actually working
like
on
that.
this book there in situ, so I had the format.
Did you say, Charles, I need a text now?
Right, and he would cut out, he had little phrases that we, because
But these phrases
this
is I'm
wasn't
looking at.
sketched out, in other words. I think it was sketched out and then it was set by the printer.
Most of the phrases in this only exist in this book. They're not.
Let go of your tongue, yeah.
But by and large, all the visual decisions are made by Susan. She might have said, "What could go here? Could you give me something that might go here below this
Actually,
image?"
Charles
And I
chose
probably
to
did
put
do
a little
that.
crossword puzzle in, because we were reading the paper and he thought it would be nice to have a little crossword puzzle, so that got sent into here. And then it has a poem underneath it, so that was a
Where,
nice
it's just a long time ago, so I can't.
Charles doesn't remember that, but I wouldn't have put the crossword puzzle in. He added the crossword puzzle. But I put the drawings in around
Previous
it.
puzzle solved. That's what I liked.
I like this one because this one is more like a painting. It's more like my paintings in that there's a lot of space.
I like the space.
It's very spaced out for a poetry book, and also the type doesn't all go in one direction. It goes in different directions, so it gives more of a sense of being like a page that is more like a drawing.
Well, and also the element, as Charles is making the point about the words actually becoming design
Yeah,
elements.
they're part of the design elements.
Whether we know their content in terms of their
Probably in
signification.
this case, because we did it that way,
You might have actually added these words like
yeah, I think
alongside
I
the
probably wrote the
drawing.
words in there. I probably wrote some of this
You
stuff
did some
in
impro-
Tucson.
So you improvised
Um,
some of it.
While we were working on it, and said, "Why don't you use this for that?" That's probably what happened.
Yeah.
And did you sign all of them, or
I don't know that they're signed actually, but they're numbered. They're each one is
each
numbered.
is numbered?
Yeah.
A book like this really you can't circulate very much, so
Right.
it's the nature of this. Unlike a poem, it's more like a painting in that way,
Right.
or like a lithograph or something like that.
Those are more like paintings. I mean, in other words, the paintings are one of a kind, and the art books that are limited edition are also, more they're more valuable,
Right.
and they're also really sort of like paintings. I mean, this one, the first one
These
I
are
did
large.
that was hand painted.
Oh.
Actually, this is a hand painted book.
Oh, beautiful.
But this is not a collaboration. This is actually the first one I did for Granary Books, which became my publisher after these other books were done.
Mm-hmm.
He actually asked me to do a book of my own, which was interesting because I had done some books of my own, but not this elaborate. And so this one actually doesn't involve a poet, photo books. So altogether I've done 11 books, but 5 with Charles, and then I've collaborated with other people. So I just feel like I don't want to be limited. So I've also done books on my own, and I've done books with Susan Howe, Johanna Drucker, and now I'm doing one with Jerry Rothenberg. So, I feel like it's good for me to collaborate, not just with him.
Like with a composer where I've written librettos, one typically thinks of the opera that results as the work of the composer, although the librettist is an important contributor to it, but in that auteur sense. And I think the artist books, especially Little Orphan Anagram Tailspin, and these are really, from my point of view, Susan's paintings that incorporate my work. So I'm delighted by that. In a lot of ways, in respect to the nature of the connection between the panel, because a book, of course, is a particular kind of binding and so on, and you move one through the next. Right. But the ability to have this larger spatial dimension of multiple elements that exist simultaneously is a kind of impossible to achieve, but implicit idea of what a book could be.
That was Susan B. and Charles Bernstein.
Right.
And that segment was about 9 minutes long that we saw. And she is being a designer, an illustrator, and he being a poet.
Yes,
known for his poetry.
Yes, he's a language poet, and he's at the University of Pennsylvania, and a
Okay,
wonderful
would you
professor.
define that, language poet?
Well, he defined it to a certain extent in that first segment in which he was speaking about the visual poetry, concrete poetry, and about his concept of collage and fragments, and where he looked to her painting and he said, isn't that interesting that she can take the different drawings that she has here, put it up on a canvas, and then it's a painting, and yet there's segments like the pages of a book. Couldn't we do that with a book? Couldn't we dismantle it and mount it on a canvas? And what is the difference? And the play is the difference between what reading a painting is and reading a book is, and what a poem is and what a painting is. And this is a query which many painters and more poets have pursued. William Carlos Williams wanted to be a painter. And so he said, in that he felt he could not be a painter, his primary profession being a physician, he would paint with words. And therefore he concentrated on the only reality in things and images. And Charles Bernstein is a part of a language that has gone beyond that. It's sort of deconstructed and allowed language a kind of fluidity. And in our everyday lives, most people's language have more fluidity than syntax and context. So we're not hearing a lot from him in this about his poetry. What we're concentrating on in this interview is their collaboration. It was very curious and interesting, which gave rise to the inspiration to do this program, though there's been quite a bit of attention in the last few years to this subject. Bob Perlman, who's also a language poet, very fine one from San Francisco. The language poets are actually concentrated here in Philadelphia now because Rachel Duplessis is over at Temple University, and there are 3 very fine representatives, Susan Howe being another one, out in San Francisco. Anyway, Bob came here, and I actually worked with him the first year that he came here. I was a reader for his course at University of Pennsylvania. And he and his wife retired from teaching at Quaker School and has gone back to her own work, and she's a visual artist. And so they did a little book where she did some drawings. They're of kind of amorphous, kind of monster-like creatures. No real relation to the poetry. Just the poetry and the creatures are together. So it was a different sort of collaboration. But as you heard from Charles, there is a real collaboration and cooperation between the two. And you see this in their intimacy in discussing the subject. And this is what I wanted to explore, where there's boundaries, whether it's husband and wife, or whether it's collegial, such as Philip Glass, who's a regular in the National Arts Program for you, has just done a musical piece on Chuck Close. and reciprocating Chuck Close having done a number of paintings of him. And so he has taken a portrait in music. And of course, it has a very different kind of imagery in music. And this crossing of boundaries is happening oftentimes. Another wonderful one is that a number of wives, like Susan B., of painters and of poets who are more famous, whom we know, are often featured in exhibitions after their death and after their husband's death. An example is Milton Avery and his wife, Sally Mitchell, or Michael. And there was a beautiful exhibit of her work in 2003 at the Knoedler. And here it shows them in partnership working. Perhaps the camera can pick that up. And I was very affected by this, that they had a living partnership in visual art, kind of cooperative and collaborative process.
But you don't hear much about that.
No, and her art tended to be more portraits, a lot of portraits of her husband and of people that they knew, and they're of great charm. There was another exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt this year of Joseph and Anni Albers. Again, Joseph Albers is far more famous in our minds than Anni. But this particular show focused on their cooperation, collaboration, intersection, joint projects, and as Susan showed us, projects which are not
Anna
done
Albers
together.
always, even when she was in school at the Bauhaus, was always with textiles,
Right,
weaving.
Right.
Whereas Joseph
the
actually
furniture.
was stained glass.
Right. He worked
And
more
it was
with
later that he became involved with the transition of painting.
That's a very fine distinction to make because they're working in different materials. Well, words and paint are different materials too, with Charles and Susan. Charles is working exclusively with words. He
But it's even further. It's even further.
He qualifies his work by saying that he can't do visually what Susan does. So that's why he's so amazed that she can, think up things to draw and to paint, because
Yeah,
he
but
thinks
can she
in
do
language.
what he does?
No,
See, so
and that's
where the collaboration comes in.
right, and that's the question that I wanted to raise, of where these boundaries shift and where there's mutual respect and cooperation, and then where the partners, whether spouses or whether professional partners. Philip Guston and Clark Coolidge is another example.
That went
Brilliant
on for
example.
quite a while.
Right. Brilliant example of an extraordinary influence in our time period. And Guston has a whole series of works with Clark's poems involved, and Clark is actually working on his memoirs now. So this is an extraordinarily rich professional, like not the same as Close and Glass, but there we have some reciprocity going on. Another example, which surprised me, was Elise Asher. Do you know her work? She is the wife, both of them deceased, of Stanley Kunitz, who's much more well known to us, the poet. And she's represented by the June Kelly Gallery, and in September and October of 2004, she writes poems and she paints. Perhaps the camera can pick up her works as well. There was a celebration of her work by the gallery, but again, post-mortem. And we didn't hear much about her in her lifetime, but we heard a great deal from her husband. I think this is fascinating because Charles very generously brought out how appreciative he is of his wife's work, how there is a kind of, not reciprocal,